It's impossible, look at you. You'll tear me apart. The whisper was worse than a scream. In the center of the master bedroom, a sobbing woman wasn't backing away, she was already at the door, clutching her coat like a shield. She stared at the man standing in the center of the room, her eyes wide with a mix of awe and absolute terror. I can't do this, Teo, she choked out, her hand trembling on the doorknob. You aren't a boyfriend. You're a natural disaster. The door didn't slam, it clicked shut with a finality that echoed like a gunshot. Quan Teo didn't chase her. He didn't yell. He simply turned to the full-length mirror. He saw the scars, the muscle, the sheer inhuman scale of his own frame. The golem, he whispered to his reflection. A giant made of clay, brought to life only to destroy. He pulled back a fist, the size of a sledgehammer, and drove it into the glass. The mirror shattered into 1,000 jagged pieces, distorting his reflection just as much as he felt distorted inside. He wasn't made for softness. He was made for war. Have you ever felt like you were too much for the world to handle? Before we see how the golem finds his peace, hit that subscribe button if you love a story where the beast finally gets the beauty. 3 months of silence followed. The penthouse in Gangnam wasn't just dirty, it was a fortress of solitude. Teo sat on the leather sofa in the dark, staring at the city skyline he ruled but couldn't enjoy. He was waiting for the world to forget him. But the silence was broken by the sound of humming. Teo stiffened. He slowly stood up, his shadow stretching across the entire living room floor. He followed the sound to the kitchen. There, standing on a step stool to reach the top shelf, was a woman. She was small, painfully small compared to him, with deep, glowing skin and a maid's uniform that looked pristine against the filth of his apartment. She was scrubbing a cabinet, humming a soft tune, completely unaware that a monster was standing behind her. Teo cleared his throat. The sound was like a growl of thunder. Who let you in? Amani didn't jump. She didn't drop her sponge. She simply paused, took a breath, and turned around on the step stool. She was eye level with his chest. She had to crane her neck all the way back just to see his face. Any other woman would have climbed down and ran. Amani just frowned at his shirt. You're bleeding, sir, she said, pointing to the knuckles he had cut on the mirror earlier. Teo blinked, stunned. He took a menacing step closer, looming over her, trying to use his size to suffocate the space between them. I said, who let you in? Do you know who I am? I know you're the man making this house a disaster zone, Amani replied, hopping down from the stool. She walked right past him, brushing within an inch of his massive arm, and picked up a first aid kit from the counter. She turned back to him, her eyes calm and dark. Now, sit down before you bleed on my clean floor. I have a lot of work to do. For 10 seconds, the only sound in the penthouse was the rhythmic, wet drip, drip, drip of blood hitting the polished marble floor. Quan Teo stood frozen, his massive chest heaving, staring down at the woman who barely reached his solar plexus. In the criminal underworld of Seoul, a single glare from him sent grown men to their knees. Yet here was Amani, holding a plastic first aid kit, waiting for him to obey like an unruly child. It was the sheer audacity that moved him. It was so absurd, so contradictory to the laws of his existence, that his legs simply gave out. He sank onto the edge of the sprawling black leather sofa, the frame groaning under his immense weight. He felt ridiculous. He felt like a tiger being scolded by a canary. Amani didn't waste a second. She snapped the kit open and set it on the coffee table, then turned to face him. Because of the way he was sitting, knees apart and hunched forward, she had to step into the space between his legs to reach him. Teo's breath hitched. The proximity was electric, terrifying. If he closed his knees, he would crush her. If he reached out, he could snap her spine. But she moved with the confident efficiency of a mechanic working on a dangerous engine, oblivious to the fact that the engine could kill her. Give me your hand, she said softly, extending her own palm. Teo hesitated. His hand was a ruin of split knuckles and embedded glass shards, shaking with adrenaline. Slowly, he lifted it. When his hand landed in hers, the contrast was almost comical. Her dark, slender fingers were swallowed by his scarred, calloused palm. She looked like she was holding a grenade. This is going to sting, she murmured, dipping a cotton ball in antiseptic. She dabbed the wound, and Teo didn't make a sound. Pain was an old friend, he understood pain. It was the gentleness he couldn't process. She used a pair of tweezers to pull out a jagged sliver of the mirror. Blood welled up, dark and thick. Teo flinched, not from the sting, but from the sudden, violent urge to pull away before she saw the ugliness beneath the skin. He waited for her to recoil. He waited for the look of disgust that always came when women realized just how much violence was etched into his body. But Amani didn't look away. She didn't tremble. She just let out a soft, frustrated TSK sound, her brow furrowed in concentration. "You really did a number on this," she whispered, wiping away a streak of fresh blood with her thumb. The touch was warm. Shockingly, impossibly warm. "It's a shame." Teo found his voice, creating a rough, unused sound in his throat. "A shame? Amani wrapped a sterile bandage around his knuckles, her touch firm but careful, treating the deadly limb as if it were something precious. She finished the knot and looked up, meeting his bewildered stare with dark, honest eyes. "You have beautiful hands, Mr. Kwan. Large. Capable. They were made to build things, I think. Not to break them." Teo sat paralyzed, the air trapped in his lungs. The silence in the room shifted. It was no longer the cold, lonely silence of a tomb. It was heavy with something else, something that terrified him more than any bullet or blade. For the first time in his life, a human being was touching him to heal, not to hurt. And for the first time, the golem didn't want to destroy the world. He just wanted to sit there, anchored by her tiny hands, and let the world fade away. The bandage on his hand felt like a shackle. For the next 3 days, Kwan Teo decided to remind the intruder exactly whose territory she was occupying. He had shown weakness, a momentary lapse of judgment induced by shock, but he would not make that mistake again. He retreated into the armor of the golem. He stopped speaking. He stopped making eye contact. He simply existed, a brooding, dark force moving through the penthouse, letting his sheer size and the suffocating silence do the work of driving her away. He stalked the hallways like an apex predator patrolling a cage. He made sure to stand in doorways, blocking the light, casting a shadow that swallowed the hallway whole. He watched her from the mezzanine, his face a mask of cold indifference. The plan was simple: suffocate her with fear until she packed her bags and fled, just like the others. But Amani didn't suffocate. She didn't even cough. She declared war, not with screams or threats, but with aggressive domesticity. It started in the kitchen. Teo walked in while she was organizing the pantry, intentionally letting his heavy footsteps echo against the marble. He stopped right behind her, looming over her small frame, radiating enough menace to clear a nightclub. He waited for the flinch. He waited for the shiver. Amani didn't turn around. She just held up a canister of beans without looking. "Coffee or tea, Mr. Kwan? I noticed you didn't touch the espresso machine yesterday, so I assumed you're a tea drinker. I bought Earl Grey." Teo stared at the back of her head, his jaw tightening. He didn't answer. He just glared, letting the silence stretch until it was uncomfortable. "Right," she chirped, placing the canister on the counter. "Tea it is. I'll have a pot ready in 10 minutes. She wasn't fighting his silence, she was filling it. She hummed constantly. It wasn't a nervous habit, it was a soft, rhythmic tune that drifted through his cold, sterile rooms, warming the air against his will. It bounced off the glass walls and settled into the leather furniture. The penthouse, which he had curated to be a fortress of solitude, was suddenly alive. The final straw came when she was dusting the library. Teo was sitting in his armchair, reading a file he hadn't turned the page of in 20 minutes, watching her struggle. She was on her tiptoes, stretching to reach the top shelf of the mahogany bookcase, her fingertips barely grazing the wood. Teo stood up. This was it. He moved silently across the rug, coming to a stop directly behind her. He stood so close that the heat of his body must have felt like a furnace against her back. He leaned over, his shadow engulfing her completely, trapping her between his massive chest and the bookshelf. Amani froze. Good, he thought. Finally. Fear. She turned her head slightly, looking up over her shoulder. Her eyes met his chin. "Oh, perfect timing," she said, wiping a smudge of dust from her cheek. "Since you're already looming, could you grab that vase on the top shelf? It needs polishing, and I'm not climbing a ladder in this skirt." Teo blinked. The menace drained out of him, replaced by a dull, throbbing confusion. She wasn't afraid of the monster, she was just using the monster as a stepladder. Defeated, Teo reached up. His arm extended easily past her head, grasping the heavy crystal vase with one hand. He brought it down and set it on the table with a heavy thud. "Thank you, sir," Amani hummed, turning back to her work without missing a beat. Teo retreated to his bedroom, closing the door with a click. He looked at his bandaged hand, then at the door where the humming was still audible. He realized, with a sinking feeling in his gut, that he wasn't haunting her. He was just her roommate. And for some terrifying reason, he didn't hate it. The morning sun struggled to pierce the heavy velvet curtains of the master bedroom, leaving the room in a state of perpetual twilight. Quan Teo stood before the mirror, a new one, replaced within hours of the incident, attempting to assemble his armor. The charcoal three-piece suit was tailored to within a millimeter of his life, designed to turn his monstrous frame into something respectable, something commanding. But the armor had a chink. His right hand, still wrapped in the white gauze Amani had applied days ago, was clumsy. The thick bandage made his fingers stiff, turning a simple task into a test of patience he was rapidly failing. The silver silk tie slipped through his fingers for the third time, the knot collapsing into a shapeless mess. Teo let out a low, vibrating growl. He glared at his own reflection, the frustration boiling over into that familiar, dark rage. He wasn't a CEO, he was a blunt instrument wrapped in silk. He seized the tie, ready to rip it from his neck and go to the meeting with his collar open, looking exactly like the thug everyone whispered he was. Stop. The word was soft, but it cut through his anger like a knife through water. Teo froze, his hands still gripping the ruined silk. He hadn't heard her enter. Amani was standing just inside the walk-in closet, a basket of fresh laundry on her hip. She set the basket down and walked toward him. She didn't ask for permission. She didn't hesitate. She moved into his personal space, a radius that most of his lieutenants were terrified to breach. Let go, she ordered, her voice calm. Teo's hands dropped to his sides, obeying before his brain could protest. Amani stepped in close. Painfully close. She had to rise onto her tiptoes, her small feet shifting on the plush rug to gain height. Even then, she barely reached his shoulders. To her, his chest must have looked like a wall of wool and muscle, a dark monolith blocking out the rest of the room. She reached up, her small, dark fingers brushing against the white collar of his shirt. She untangled the mess he had made, smoothing the silk with practiced ease. Teo stopped breathing. He stared down at the top of her head, watching the way her natural hair caught the dim light. He could smell her, not perfume, but something clean and warm, like vanilla and rain. It clashed violently with the sharp, cold scent of his expensive cologne. The silence in the room was deafening, amplified by the thudding of his own heart against his ribs. It was hammering a frantic rhythm, one that had nothing to do with anger. She looped the fabric, her knuckles grazing his throat. The touch sent a shockwave through him that nearly buckled his knees. He was used to people touching him with violence, or with fear, or with a greedy desperation. He was not used to being groomed. He was not used to being cared for. With a final tug, she slid the knot up, cantering it perfectly against his throat. She smoothed the lapels of his jacket, her palms resting flat against his chest for a fleeting second. She could surely feel the frantic beat of the heart beneath the muscle, but she said nothing about it. She stepped back, dropping to her heels, and looked him in the eye. There, she said, a small, satisfied smile playing on her lips. Now you look like a boss, not a brawler. Teo couldn't speak. He couldn't move. He felt tethered to the spot, grounded by the ghost of her touch on his chest. For a man who had spent his life adrift in a sea of violence, he suddenly felt found. He felt anchored. The silence of the penthouse at 2 in the morning was usually Teo's only comfort. It was the only time the city stopped demanding things from him, the only time he could shed the armor of the three-piece suit and just be a body. He stepped out of the steam-filled bathroom, his skin flushed from the scalding water, a white towel hitched loosely around his waist. He didn't bother to knot it tightly. In his mind, the penthouse was still a fortress where no one else existed. He had forgotten, for a brief, steam-drunk moment, that he was no longer alone. He turned the corner into the long, dimly lit hallway that connected the guest wing to the master suite. Amani was there. She was standing by the linen closet, clutching a fresh stack of pillowcases, looking soft and sleep-rumpled in an oversized t-shirt. They both froze. The sudden halt of Teo's massive momentum did what gravity had been threatening to do since he left the shower. The towel slipped. It didn't flutter, it fell heavy and wet, pooling instantly at his feet. Time didn't just stop, it disintegrated. Teo stood completely exposed, a titan of muscle and scars, revealed in the unforgiving mood lighting of the hallway. The silence that followed was louder than a gunshot. This was the nightmare scenario. This was the exact moment that had ended his engagement, the moment the monster was fully unveiled, the moment the whispers about his inhuman size became undeniable reality. He braced himself. His muscles locked up, turning him into a statue of dread. He waited for the scream. He waited for the look of revulsion, for the hands flying to the mouth, for the inevitable backward stumble of terror. He had seen it before. He knew exactly what fear looked like when it was confronted with something that didn't fit the world's understanding of normal. "Look away," he screamed internally. "Run." Amani didn't run. She stared. Her eyes, wide and dark, traveled down the length of his torso, tracing the violent map of scars on his chest, the ridges of his abdomen, and lower, to the reality that had made other women call him a freak of nature. But she didn't gasp. She didn't turn pale. Instead, Teo watched, stunned, as a deep, unmistakable flush rose from her neck to her cheeks, darkening her skin even in the shadows. Her lips parted, but no scream came out, only a sharp, ragged intake of breath. Her eyes didn't hold the cold, sharp glint of terror. They held the heavy, humid weight of shock and heat. She wasn't looking at a monster. She was looking at a man. The realization hit Teo harder than a physical blow. The air in the hallway suddenly felt thick, charged with a voltage that scorched his skin. "Oh my God," Amani breathed, the words tumbling out in a rush of panicked embarrassment, not fear. I am so sorry, sir." She spun around so fast she nearly tripped over her own feet, clutching the pillowcases to her chest like a shield. "I didn't know, I was just, good night." She scrambled down the hall, disappearing into the guest room and slamming the door shut. Teo stood alone in the hallway, the water from his hair dripping onto his shoulders. He looked down at the towel on the floor, then at the closed door where she had fled. His heart was hammering against his ribs, but the cold pit of shame that usually lived in his stomach was gone. In its place was a strange, burning ember. She hadn't fled because she was scared of him. She had fled because she was flustered by him. He reached down and picked up the towel, a ghost of a smirk touching his lips for the first time in years. The monster was dead. The box on the bed was black velvet, tied with a silver ribbon. Inside lay a weapon made of silk, a floor-length gown in a shade of deep, iridescent emerald. When Amani stepped out of the dressing room, the fabric clinging to her frame like liquid gem, the air in the penthouse seemed to vanish. The green didn't just complement her dark skin, it worshipped it. Teo stood by the door, encased in his signature charcoal suit, watching her. For weeks, he had hidden her away, terrified that his world would taint her. But the hallway incident had shifted something tectonic deep inside him. If she wasn't afraid of the beast, then the beast had no reason to hide. Tonight, he wasn't taking a maid to dinner. He was taking a queen to war. "You look?" Teo's voice died in his throat, too rough for the vision before him. He stepped forward, his massive frame eclipsing the light, and offered his arm. Dangerous. The auction was held in the vault, a subterranean chamber beneath the city where Seoul's most dangerous shadows gathered to trade secrets and art. It was a dark, seated affair, low ceilings, heavy mahogany tables, and air thick with cigar smoke and silent judgment. When the heavy iron doors swung open and Quan Teo stepped through, the low hum of conversation didn't taper off, it was severed. Silence crashed into the room. Every eye turned to the entrance. They expected the golem to be alone, a brooding monolith of violence. They did not expect him to have a hand, large enough to crush a skull, resting gently, possessively, on the waist of a woman who looked like royalty. Teo didn't look at the crowd. He didn't nod to the crime bosses or the corrupt politicians. He guided Amani to the center table in the front row, his body shielding her from the room. He pulled out her chair, a gesture of reverence that sent a ripple of shock through the onlookers. The message was deafeningly loud without a single word spoken: "Look, but do not touch." Amani sat, her spine straight, though her pulse fluttered visible at her throat. She scanned the room, her eyes lingering for a fraction of a second on Lot 42, a melancholic, stormy seascape painting that reminded her of the view from the penthouse. "Do you like it?" Teo murmured, leaning in close, his shoulder brushing hers. "It's lonely," she whispered. "But beautiful." The auctioneer started the bidding at 500,000. An arm shot up in the back. 600. 7. Teo didn't check the catalog. He didn't check his bank account. He simply lifted a single finger. 5 million, he rumbled. The auctioneer choked. The room froze. It was an obscene amount, an aggressive, bullying bid that ended the contest before it began. Teo wasn't buying art, he was buying a smile from the woman next to him. He slowly turned his head, scanning the room with a cold, dead-eyed glare, daring anyone to raise a paddle against him. No one moved. The golem has officially claimed her. If you are loving this power move, drop a fire emoji in the comments right now. Teo turned back to Amani, whose eyes were wide with shock. He rested his hand over hers on the table, his thumb sweeping over her knuckles. He didn't care about the painting. He cared that for the first time in his life, the whispers behind his back weren't about his size or his cruelty. They were about her. And he would burn the city down to keep it that way. High above the auction floor, obscured by the heavy velvet drapes of a private viewing box, Director Han watched the scene unfold with the cold, detached interest of a scientist studying a new bacteria. He swirled the amber liquid in his glass, his eyes fixed not on the painting that had just sold for $5 million, but on the hand resting on the woman's waist. Han knew Quan Teo. He knew the golem. He had watched Teo dismantle syndicates and break bones with the indifference of a machine. The golem did not have attachments. He did not have soft spots. He was a fortress of scar tissue and violence. But tonight, the fortress had lowered the drawbridge. Han watched as Teo leaned down. The movement was slight, almost imperceptible to the untrained eye, but to Han, it screamed louder than a siren. Teo lowered his massive head to catch a whisper from the small woman beside him. His eyes, usually dead and flat, crinkled at the corners. He wasn't just guarding her, he was orbiting her. Han smiled, a thin, bloodless expression that didn't reach his eyes. So, he whispered to the empty room, the monster went and found himself a heart. He didn't signal his men to attack. A brawl in the vault was messy and expensive. Besides, attacking the golem when he was alert was suicide. But attacking the heart? That was simply surgery. Han set his glass down, adjusted his cufflinks, and slipped out the back exit into the night. He had seen enough. The unkillable man finally had a mortal wound waiting to be opened. The next morning, the sun flooded the penthouse with a cruel, deceptive brightness. The tension of the auction seemed a lifetime away. Amani was humming again, a vibrant, happy sound that bounced off the stainless steel appliances in the kitchen. She was chopping vegetables with a rhythmic thud-thud-thud, her emerald dress replaced by jeans and a sweater. Teo sat at the island, watching her over the rim of his coffee mug. He felt light, untethered. The painting was being delivered later, but he didn't care about the canvas. He cared about the fact that she was still here, humming in his kitchen. It needs polo masala, Amani declared, frowning at a pot of simmering broth. And real cardamom. Not this dust you have in the jar. Teo set his mug down. I can send a driver. To the open market in Itaewon? Amani laughed, wiping her hands on a towel. He wouldn't know what to look for. He'd come back with curry powder and I'd have to fire him. No, I'll go. I promise to make you a proper Kenyan stew to celebrate, and I don't break promises. Teo opened his mouth to argue, to tell her that she shouldn't leave his sight, that the city was dangerous. But the morning sun was so bright, and the domestic peace was so intoxicating, that his paranoia felt heavy and misplaced. He wanted to be normal. He wanted to be a man whose girlfriend just ran a simple errand. Take the black card, was all he said, his voice rumbled with a reluctant softness. Amani grinned, grabbed her purse, and leaned over the counter to press a quick, feather-like kiss to his cheek. I'll be back before the broth boils down. Don't touch anything. She walked to the door, her sneakers squeaking softly on the marble. Teo watched her go, a strange, sudden tightness gripping his chest. He almost called out her name. He almost told her to wait. See you soon, golem, she teased, closing the heavy oak door behind her. The lock clicked shut. Teo sat in the silence, listening to the broth bubble, waiting for the sound of the elevator. He didn't know it yet, but that click was the last sound of peace he would hear for a very long time. The broth would boil away, the sun would set, and the door would not open again. The smell hit him first. It wasn't the rich, warm aroma of cardamom and cloves he had been promised. It was the acrid, bitter scent of something burning. Quan Teo stood in the center of the kitchen, the silence pressing against his eardrums like deep water. The pot on the stove had boiled dry hours ago, the bottom scorched black, a ruined monument to a lunch that never happened. The silence wasn't the peaceful quiet of the morning, it was heavy, suffocating, and wrong. It was the silence of a grave. Amani? His voice cracked, a rare sound of vulnerability that died instantly in the empty air. There was no humming. No squeak of sneakers. No teasing laugh calling him golem. He walked further into the room, his heart beginning a slow, heavy thud against his ribs, a war drum signaling disaster. His boot crunched on something near the refrigerator. He looked down. It was her phone. The screen was shattered, a spiderweb of cracks over the glass. But the device was still on, pulsating with a single notification. Teo knelt, his massive hand trembling as he picked it up. He didn't need a passcode. The message was displayed on the lock screen. It was a photo. Amani was tied to a metal chair in a dimly lit warehouse. Her head was bowed, her beautiful natural hair messy, a bruise blossoming purple on her cheekbone. The world tilted. A cold, sharp spear of panic pierced Teo's chest, breathless and agonizing. It wasn't the hot flash of anger he was used to, this was ice. It was the terrified realization that the one thing tethering him to humanity had been ripped away. He didn't roar. He didn't smash the counters. He went deadly, terrifyingly still. The elevator chimed. 3 of his lieutenants rushed in, their faces pale. They had tracked the phone's signal loss. They saw the burnt pot, the shattered glass, and the monster kneeling on the floor. "Sir," the head of security stammered, holding an assault rifle against his chest. "We've traced the origin of the message. It's a dockside warehouse in District 9. Director Han's territory. We have a tactical team on standby. We can breach in 20 minutes. We'll retrieve the asset." Teo slowly stood up. He loomed over them, his eyes hollowed out, void of any light that Amani had put there. He looked at the man who had called her an asset. "Stand down," Teo whispered. The sound was worse than a scream. "But sir, it's a trap. Han wants you to come. We need a strategy. We can't risk." "Strategy?" Teo let out a dry, humorless laugh. He reached up and unbuttoned his suit jacket, the expensive, tailored armor he wore to pretend he was a civilized CEO. He let it drop to the floor, uncaring. Then, he began to unbutton his cuffs. "You think this is business," Teo said, his voice dropping an octave as he rolled up his white sleeves. The fabric folded back to reveal the dark, intricate ink of dragons and demons that twisted up his forearms, the marks of the golem. "You think they stole money. You think they stole leverage." He finished rolling his sleeves, his forearms corded with veins and lethal intent. He looked at his reflection in the dark window. The monster was back, but this time, the monster had a purpose. "They didn't take an asset," Teo growled, turning to the door, his hands balling into fists that could shatter concrete. "They took my heart. I will go alone." The rain had turned into a deluge, hammering against the corrugated metal roof of the warehouse in District 9. Inside, 20 armed men stood guard, their nerves frayed by the storm. Outside, there was no tactical team. No sirens. Just the rhythmic, heavy sound of footsteps splashing through deep puddles, getting louder, getting closer. The front doors didn't open, they exploded inward. Twisted metal groaned and shrieked as Quan Teo kicked the locking mechanism with enough force to tear the steel frame from the concrete. He stepped into the dim light, water streaming off his white dress shirt, his hands empty at his sides. "He's unarmed," one of the guards shouted, raising a crowbar. "Get him." It was the last mistake he ever made. Teo didn't fight, he demolished. He moved with a terrifying speed that belied his size, a blur of kinetic energy that slammed into the first line of defense. The guard with the crowbar swung. Teo didn't block, he caught the weapon mid-swing, snapped the man's wrist with a sickening crack, and hurled him bodily into a stack of wooden crates 10 feet away. The crates shattered on impact. Bullets began to fly. A shot grazed Teo's shoulder, tearing through the fine cotton of his shirt and biting into flesh. He didn't even blink. He was the golem, clay brought to life for a single purpose. Pain was irrelevant. He closed the distance to the gunman, grabbing the barrel of the rifle and jerking it upward so violently the man was lifted off his feet. A single punch to the chest collapsed the guard's ribcage like wet cardboard. He was a hurricane of violence. He tore through the warehouse, absorbing blows that would have felled a normal man. A pipe struck his back, he spun and backhanded the attacker into a concrete pillar. He was methodical, silent, and absolutely terrifying. He wasn't avoiding damage, he was trading it, accepting bruises and cuts as the price of admission to reach the only thing that mattered. He reached the heavy steel door at the back of the facility. He didn't bother with the handle. He rammed his shoulder into it, the metal buckling under the force of his rage, and stumbled into the office. Director Han stood behind a desk, his face pale but his smile twisted into a mask of arrogant triumph. He had one arm wrapped around Amani's neck, a serrated hunting knife pressed dangerously close to her jugular. Amani was crying, her lips split, but her eyes locked onto Teo's. "Stop!" Han screamed, his voice cracking. "One step, Golem. One step and I open her throat. Look at you, bleeding like a pig. I told you, you're nothing but a..." Han laughed, a high, nervous sound. He thought the knife gave him leverage. He thought the laws of negotiation applied here. He thought Teo was a man who could be reasoned with. He was wrong. Teo didn't pause to negotiate. He didn't offer money. He saw the bruise on Amani's face, and the last tether of his humanity snapped. The movement was too fast for Han to process. Teo surged forward, covering the 10 feet between them in a heartbeat. Han tried to jerk the knife, but a massive hand clamped around his wrist, crushing the bones instantly. The knife clattered to the floor. In the same motion, Teo grabbed Han by the throat and lifted him into the air. Han's feet kicked uselessly. Teo didn't speak. He didn't explain. He simply delivered a single, thunderous blow to Han's chest, a strike fueled by a lifetime of isolation and 3 hours of pure terror. Han dropped like a stone, silent and still. The golem stood over him, chest heaving, his white shirt now a tapestry of crimson, the silence returning to the room as heavy as the storm outside. The violence ended as abruptly as it had begun, leaving a ringing silence that screamed louder than the storm outside. Director Han lay motionless on the floor, a broken doll discarded by a careless giant. Quan Teo stood over him, his chest heaving like a dying engine, his white shirt soaked so thoroughly in crimson that it clung to his skin like a second, gruesome layer. The adrenaline crashed. The golem vanished, leaving behind a terrified man shaking in the aftermath of his own brutality. Teo looked down at his hands. They were painted red. He looked at the wreckage of the room, the shattered furniture, the dented walls, the corpse at his feet. The realization hit him with the force of a physical blow, she saw. He stumbled backward, retreating until his back hit the cold concrete wall. He couldn't breathe. The air tasted like copper and ozone. He slid down the wall slightly, his legs trembling, and brought his bloodied hands up to cover his face, desperate to hide the monster from the only person who mattered. "Don't look," he begged, his voice a jagged ruin. "Please. Don't look at me. I'm dirty." He waited for the sound of her retching. He waited for her to run out the broken door and into the rain, away from the beast who tore men apart with his bare hands. Instead, he heard the soft shuffle of footsteps approaching him. Amani stood up from the chair, her limbs stiff, her cheek bruising purple. She didn't look at the door. She looked at him. She stepped over the debris, navigating the ruins of the fight without flinching. She walked right up to the trembling giant in the corner. "Teo," she whispered. He shook his head, pressing his hands harder against his eyes. "I'm a disaster. I'm too much." Amani reached out. Her small hands, shaking slightly, wrapped around his massive, blood-slicked wrists. She didn't recoil at the texture. She pulled, gently but firmly, forcing him to lower his guard. When he finally looked at her, his eyes were wide and wet with shame. He expected to see horror in her gaze. Instead, he saw a fierce, heartbreaking relief. "You came for me," she said, her voice steady. She didn't care about the blood. She reached up, cupping his jaw, her thumb smearing the red stain across his cheek as she pulled his face down to hers. She kissed him, not a tentative peck, but a desperate, deep collision of souls. It tasted of salt and iron, a seal on a pact made in blood. The fight left Teo's body completely. He crumbled, sinking to his knees before her, burying his face in the fabric of her ruined dress. He wrapped his arms around her waist, holding on as if she were the only solid thing in a spinning universe. He sobbed once, a harsh, broken sound, and Amani rested her chin on the top of his head, stroking his hair, whispering that he was safe. But safety is a lie in the city of shadows. Far away, on a rooftop overlooking the warehouse, a figure lies in wait. A gloved hand adjusts the scope. A crosshair settles on the golem's back. And a tiny red laser dot appears, right over his heart. That ending. Do you think they survived the sniper? Let me know your theories in the comments, and don't forget to like this video for part 2.